So here we are at The Escape, the third episode of the second serial of Doctor Who. We pick up right with the cliffhanger at the end of the previous episode, The Survivors. It's not much of a cliffhanger. It's really just Susan having retrieved the drugs that they needed, turning around and having to walk back out into the forest again. So, she does so, and there she meets Aladdin, one of the Thals. Initially, she's very scared of him, but she's also very impressed with him. And he gives her an extra set of drugs to bring with her back into the Dalek city in case the Daleks don't allow her and her friends to use the drugs that she had retrieved. This turns out to be a wise move because that's exactly what happens. The Daleks take the initial set of drugs, but they do allow her to give the drugs to herself and to her friends in order to give them a false sense of security. The Daleks then talk to Susan. She explains that the Thals are looking for help with food because they're starving, and the Daleks get her to write a note to the Thals offering them food. However, this is a trick. The Daleks intend to bring the Thals into their city and kill them. Realizing this, the travelers decide to escape from their cell. The Doctor deduces that the Daleks draw their power from static electricity from the floor, and they use the cloak that Aladdin gave Susan to insulate the Dalek from the floor so that they can disable it. Ian puts himself inside the Dalek casing, and they proceed to attempt to escape. And that is the plot of The Escape. In terms of general impressions about the episode, the first episode of the serial, The Dead Planet, to me was all about atmosphere. The second episode, The Survivors, was about world building, about giving them an idea of what world they landed in. This episode is more about plot. There is a little bit of world building in there as we meet the Thals and learn a bit about them, but this is more about moving events along, about the characters taking action moving forward. We establish the threat to the Thals, that they're starving. That gives them motivation for acting. We also establish that the Dalek trap is going to kill them all. That's another motive for action on the part of the regular characters. The real meat of the plot comes in the escape itself. We see that the regulars work together in a crisis. They have a collective plan here. Everybody has a part. Susan is the bait. Ian blocks the door. Barbara blinds the Daleks. And Ian and the Doctor wrestle the Dalek onto the cloak, disabling it. The Doctor displays more of his conspicuous intelligence in this episode, figuring out that the Daleks are powered by static electricity. Indeed, as soon as he comes up with the idea, the Doctor pretty much dominates the discussion about it. Hartnell plays very well that the Doctor is kind of enjoying figuring this out, even in spite of the danger that they're in. It's also interesting to note that the Doctor does leave room for the possibility that he might be wrong. He repeatedly says, if I'm right, without assuming that he is. That's interesting for the Doctor, and a little bit of a departure from what we've seen from him so far. The Doctor is not faking being more sure about things than he is. This is a contrast to things like when he pretended he was absolutely sure there was nothing dangerous in the forest in the previous serial. It is interesting to note, however, that once the plan goes forward and seems to be working, he seems to sort of regain that confidence. When Ian gets in the Dalek and then can't move it internally, and they decide they're just going to push it, Ian expresses a fear that, they'll be noticed, and the Doctor's just like, oh, no, nobody will notice a thing. When honestly, it seems like something people would notice, but he's just sort of blowing that off and assuming that the plan will work, so he seems to have gotten his confidence back. It's a little unclear to me whether he's actually sure it'll work or whether he's just decided that it's worth a shot no matter what. As for Ian himself, he also displays intelligence. The Doctor's the one to figure out how the static electricity idea works, but Ian jumps right on that, suggesting the cloak to insulate. Basically, the Doctor defines the problem, but Ian comes up with a solution for it. And Barbara comes up with the mud. She sees the dirt on Susan's shoes, uses the water from the food they've been given, and creates a big glob of mud to stick on the Dalek camera lens. It's a good idea. And I have to say that after the past episode, in which Barbara did very little, it's nice to see Barbara really contributing again. I also thought it was interesting that the Doctor congratulates her on the idea. which is pretty rare for him at this stage to congratulate either Ian or Barbara. But it does fit with what I was talking about in the past couple episodes, which is that the Doctor greatly values intelligence, seeing it as almost the most important thing about a given person. So when Barbara does something clever, his immediate reaction is to be happy about it, as opposed to when he's previously basically been thinking of Ian and Barbara as stupid. The Doctor appreciates intelligence. While on the subject of intelligence, though, Susan's idea for their escape is for them to all pretend to be dead, and when the Dalek comes in to investigate, to rush down the hallway and escape, which is the exact same plan they used to get out of the Cave of Skulls in the previous serial. It's not particularly original. It also likely wouldn't work, given how large the Dalek is and how it would probably just sort of stay in the doorway. So Susan doesn't really contribute any significant ideas to the plan. She's sort of the bait to get the Dalek to come in, but the ideas are all the Doctor's and Ian's and Barbara's. Now this is somewhat made up for by the fact that Susan has a real prominent part early in the episode, meeting Aladon and learning about the Thals, and talking to the Daleks earlier, but she doesn't really contribute much to the escape itself. She doesn't do nothing, but I think it would be fair to say she's not quite acting on the same level as the others. There's also the scene earlier in which she's talking to the Daleks and gives away that they've figured out that the Daleks can observe them and hear them when they're in their cell. It's things like this that tend to make me not like Susan quite as much as the other characters. They tend to do things that are contributing. Susan's tending to do things that are sort of to the detriment of their well-being. This is nothing against Carol Ann Ford, who I think plays Susan very well. I'm just talking about the character, not the actress. But speaking of acting, we get a whole bunch of new actors in this because we introduced the Thals. The first thing we notice about them is that they're portrayed as physical perfection. As Susan very clearly says, "You're perfect." Indeed, I think it's fair to say Susan's a bit smitten with Aladon, purely based on looks. It's worth noting that the Thals, being as physically perfect as they are, is not incompatible with the Daleks' description of them as having mutated. Mutation is adaptation to the environment, and being physically powerful humanoids is advantageous to farming and traveling, which are the two main things we've learned the Thals do. Even the Thals' general attractiveness makes sense in terms of rebuilding their population after the war that had nearly wiped them out. Now, to be clear, I'm aware that both I and the show itself are taking a bit of liberty in terms of how mutation and evolution actually work. This will be far from the last time Doctor Who doesn't get evolution right. I'm looking right at you, full circle. I do think it's a little bit unfortunate that the concept of physical perfection in the Thals that is portrayed is essentially Aryan perfection. They're tall, they're blonde, I believe they're supposed to have blue eyes if I remember the novelization correctly. They're very muscular. They're Aryan supermen. There's a bit of irony to this in that, the Daleks are essentially science fiction Nazis, and yet it's the Thals who embody the, Nazi ideal of what a humanoid is supposed to look like. I do think it's interesting, and it makes me wonder whether that's a deliberate irony, or if Terry Nation, like so many people, had just sort of absorbed the concept that that's what perfection looks like and went with it unconsciously. In addition to how they look, we learn a bit about Thal society. We learn that the Thals are farmers and pacifists, and that they've been relying on a great rainfall that I believe is 2 years overdue now, and so they've been traveling since then looking for a new source of food. So basically they've gone from being farmers to essentially being nomads now. I do think it's interesting, based on what Aladon says, that the Thals were not sure if the Daleks had survived the war or not. This, to me, implies a complete lack of contact between the Daleks and the Thals since the time of the war. We contrast that with the previous episode in which the Daleks immediately assumed the travelers to be Thals, which implies that the Daleks inherently believe the Thals survived. But if you think about it, that fits with Dalek paranoia. The Thals, who are not paranoid, are leaving the question open. The Daleks are assuming the worst, which is that their enemies have survived and are still a threat. Speaking of being a threat, it is mentioned that the Thals used to be warriors. It is also mentioned that the Daleks used to be teachers and philosophers. That raises a question. Were the Thals the original aggressors in the war? In 60 years of Doctor Who, well, it'll be 60 this November, We have never seen pre-war Skaro. Every time we go back and look at early eras of Skaro, it's during the war. In Genesis of the Daleks, both sides seem to be pretty awful, but Genesis of the Daleks is set in the final days of a 1,000-year war. We don't know what things were like before that. It would be kind of interesting to explore that, I think. So we've established that the Thals are starving, that they need food. This creates a jeopardy situation. It means that the Thals just can't turn around and leave. They need to stay, they need to find food. That drives the plot forward. So, that's the Thals as a group, but what about the Thals as individuals? The first Thal we meet is Aladon. John Lee, who plays Aladon, has a gift for dramatic poses. Reminds me a little bit of William Shatner in early Star Trek. Aladon is presented as imposing at first. There's a lightning strike right as he first shows up, which kind of makes him frightening. He's wearing that cloak, which kind of makes him appear a bit inhuman at first. The cloak will, of course, pull double duty, in that in addition to doing that, it's used to help escape the Dalek later. So it's there both to make an impression about Aladon, but also to further the plot later. John Lee also holds that initial imposing pose on purpose, for the purpose of being frightening. It's worth noting when I say for the purpose of being frightening, he's trying to frighten the audience a bit, not Susan. Clearly he wants Susan to trust him. But that's just Aladon's physical presence. What about his personality? My first impression of Aladon is that he's cautious. He's cautious about whether you can trust the Daleks, and hence he gives Susan the extra drugs. When he talks to Temesis later, he's clearly cautious about trusting them, questioning Temesis, who is clearly seen as a very wise and respected leader. So Aladon is not cowardly, but wary of potential danger. Moving on to other Thals, there's Dione. Dione is the only female Thal who gets a name and gets any lines. Sadly, Dione is really just there to be fodder for a bunch of sexist jokes. Dione seems largely defined by her attraction to Aladon. I'm not always a big fan of using the Bechdel test to evaluate female characters, but if I were and you were to run Dione through it, she pretty much fails it. She's defined solely by her attraction to a male character. In addition to Dione, there's Temesis, the leader. As I mentioned before, he's clearly a very wise and respected leader. He kind of speaks in homilies, little phrases designed to teach you something. It's almost Zen. But he seems to want to teach. He seems to want his people to flourish, both as a larger society and as individuals. Some of the advice he gives Aladon is about how to act for the greater good. Some of it is more personal, particularly when he's talking to him about Dione. In terms of casting, Alan Wheatley, who plays Temesis, feels like the perfect choice. His voice has that perfect ring to inspire trust and inspiration. Essentially, Temesis is the perfect peacetime leader, which is a shame because peacetime is about to end. And the last major Thal we meet is Ganatus. Ganatus is played by Philip Bond, and Philip Bond is probably the best actor amongst the people playing the Thals. Bond gives Ganatus a real personality. He's easygoing, he's playful, he's funny. About the only significant thing that seems to bother him is people questioning him about his brother. He seems very defensive about him. It's worth noting we don't actually meet the brother in this episode. Ganatus feels like a person, not just a plot function. And quite frankly, all the other Thals at some point in the episode feel like a plot function. Even Aladon. They are there largely to contrast and be the potential victims of the Daleks. Speaking of the Daleks, we do get a little bit more about them in this episode as well. We learn a bit about Dalek science in this episode, and that we learn that they are powered by static electricity drawn up from the metal floors in their city. That power source will change several times in the future, but it's very consistent in this first serial. We also experience a bit more of Dalek society in this episode. We see that again they are operating from a series of assumptions about the world around them, some of which are warranted, some of which are not. For instance, they are not even vaguely fooled when the travelers destroy the camera in their cell, clearly realizing it's deliberate even though they were trying to make it look accidental. But on the flip side, the Daleks assume incorrectly that the Thals will act aggressively. Why do they do this? Well, because that's what the Daleks would do, and their paranoia leads them to assume that the Thals would do the same. There's also the bit where the Daleks talk about giving the travelers a false sense of security. It seems as though they're overestimating their ability to sell that sense of security to the travelers. Or, perhaps more accurately, they're underestimating how well the travelers can see through them. I find the scene where the Daleks are gathered around Susan as she writes the note for the Thals interesting, because the Daleks pretty much can't contain their aggression throughout this scene. Even as they're dictating the note, they're being very, very aggressive. When Susan laughs at one point, they react as if that was an attack. It just speaks to the level of Dalek paranoia. And of course, they don't understand what Susan means when she explains her name. I've always found that a little bit interesting. Daleks don't seem to have names, which is a bit odd because they clearly have a hierarchical society, so it makes me wonder how they designate each other. They must have some sort of designation. I suppose it must mean that they designate themselves by their strata within Dalek society, not as individuals, but it's interesting to contemplate. We also get the first use by a Dalek of the word extermination in this episode as they contemplate what to do with the prisoners. I must admit that despite having seen this serial countless times, I had misremembered and I had thought it didn't happen until the next episode. In this episode, extermination seems to be the fallback plan. When the Daleks are discussing whether or not they should release the prisoners, the Dalek says no, and another one immediately goes, extermination then, as if, those are the only two options. You either let them go or you kill them. That speaks, I think, to how extermination is emblematic of the Dalek mindset. It's not killing or murder, it's extermination. It's not what you do with an equal, it's what you do with a pest or a bug. It's the way Daleks view other life forms. Lesser and a nuisance. When the Dalek is attacked during the prisoner's escape later, it reinforces this. When Ian and the Doctor grab it, it reacts as if it's being touched by something icky. It repeats the phrase, get away from me, get away from me, get away from me, over and over as they hold on to it. It's not just a reaction of hate, but of fear. It's almost a phobic reaction. I know that throughout Doctor Who's history, I've always felt that the Daleks' claim that they don't feel fear is a lie. The only real question to me is, did they ever have fear really removed from themselves, or was it always there? Was it removed and made a return, or was it never successfully removed in the first place? So those are the main bits of the episode. Little things. I always find amusing the bit where the Daleks pick up Susan's note with their plungers. I know what they were trying to do. They were trying to show that these plungers can be used to manipulate objects, but I can't help feeling that it looks a bit silly and awkward. On the flip side of things, during the escape, it's abundantly clear that Daleks are very strong. It almost pushes, I forget who it was, maybe Ian, into a wall. It's clearly taking every bit of strength that the travelers have to keep it from just sort of throwing them off and escaping. They're just lucky enough to get it onto the cloak so that it doesn't have power anymore. After that happens, you get a great shot that I like of Ian and the Doctor reacting to the unseen creature within the Dalek casing. This is accompanied by what I can only describe as a bubbly sound effect. Their facial reactions to it are great, especially William Russell's. It's a reminder that if you're trying to sort of portray horror, what can be really scary is what you don't see. But then, of course, we do see it a little bit. It's very brief, but we get a tiny little view of the Dalek creature. In retrospect, now that we are looking at it with much more clarity than probably its original broadcast, it's pretty painfully clear that what we're seeing is a hand in a stylized glove. But it's very brief, and it's effective for as long as it's on screen. They don't linger on it. Honestly, the look of the internal Dalek creature will change an awful lot over the course of the history of Doctor Who. It's always the same general idea, sort of a tentacled, squiddy creature, but exactly how it's realized will change quite a few times. It even has in the new series a bit. In terms of first, this is the first time we see a human or a humanoid get inside a Dalek, in this case Ian. I like the little bit where Ian fakes the monotone of the Dalek, and in general they're ready to make the rest of their escape. I have always had one small question about the escape. They run the Dalek onto the cloak, and then they're going to try to get the Dalek creature out. And they run the Dalek off of the cloak so that they can use it to pick the creature up. Shouldn't the Dalek have repowered as soon as they pulled it off the cloak again? I mean, do Daleks need a constant source of power, Or they deactivate? Maybe. I don't know. I mean, maybe they don't really store power. I mean, as I think about it, they really can't store power. Otherwise, it would have been able to keep going for a bit after they'd run it onto the cloak. I suspect these are technical questions that really weren't in the forefront of Terry Nation's mind, but it's interesting to kind of contemplate. And then we get a cliffhanger. Well, kind of a cliffhanger. It's what I was talking about before. We get to see that tiny little bit of the Dalek creature. So it's not really much of a cliffhanger at all. The travelers aren't in any more danger, or there isn't any new danger that they weren't facing before. It's really just moving from one phase of their escape to the other. They've escaped the cell. Now they have to try to escape the whole city. And so we leave our main characters trapped in the Dalek city and trying to escape. The Daleks on the verge of betraying and murdering the Thals. With a setup like that, how can you not want to know what happens next?